Good morning and happy Sabbath.
Morning.
It is my honor and privilege and humbled actually, to bring you a Black History Spotlight, a Black History moment. And my topic is, hopefully you can see on the screen. My topic is Black Native Americans. And I always been intrigued by this because most people who are African American and have been in this country for a while will say, or have a relative that says, oh yes, we're part Native American, we're part Cherokee, we're part Lakota, we're part whatever. And we do that because we say it with pride. We recognize the joint struggle. We recognize that we were brought over, we were ripped from our home country in Africa and forcibly brought over to this country as slaves. But we also recognize that the indigenous people that were already here for thousands of years, they had their land taken away from them. And treaty after treaty that was negotiated with the colonialists that were or the colonizers that came were broken repeatedly. And you had the Trail of Tears and all that. So we kind of recognize the shared struggle and the intermixing that history has proved between the African slaves and the Native American people throughout this country. But in doing so, I kind of wanted to spotlight this and also kind of put some truth to fiction or some myths that went around. And basically what I always envision African American history or Black History Month is truth. And truth is good or bad, it is what it is, but it's truth. But the sooner we deal with and recognize what truth is, the better we can to cope with it, deal with it, and move forward. So here are some of the things that I have, just a few things you should know about Black Indians. First, how we hooked up. The earliest recorded African and Native American contact occurred in April 1502, when the first enslaved Africans were taken to Hispaniola. Some Africans escaped to Santo Domingo. The first Black Native Americans emerged from these groups. And you can see it now in Dominican Republic, in Haiti, and all throughout the Caribbean and Central America and South America. Those groups intermix and now become intertwined with the culture. The second, some Native American tribes actually did hold slaves. Now again, this is some say the inconvenient truth. There is evidence, unfortunately, the relationship hasn't always been that great. Some tribes did hold African Americans as slaves, maybe not to the degree or treated them to the degree that the Europeans did, but it's still nonetheless. And some Native American tribes actually fought for the Confederacy. The dynamic is complex, but like anything else, but that doesn't still negate that there is still an intermixing, there is still intermarrying, there's still our offspring for those arrangements, just like most of us here, which I'll get to in my other point, most African Americans are still a product of intermixing between the European influence. The next one, that you do not have, many of us do not have as much Native American in it as we may think. Harvard University's historian Lewis Henry Gates wrote in 2009, only 5% of all Black Americans have at least 12.5% Native American ancestry. That's the equivalent of at least one great-grandparent. So some of the features that we attributed, oh, you got that hair, that long straight hair from being part of this tribe or that tribe, it may be true, but more than likely, it came from your European ancestry. So, but that doesn't mean that it still doesn't exist, 12.5%. Again, we're equivalent to one great-grandparent. And again, as African Americans, we are still proud of that because we recognize the shared struggle. So it is something that, in doing more research on Black Indians, how Black Americans, particularly that have a strong tribal identity, are very, very loyal to that and take as much pride to that. And you can see on the screen the different pictures of Native American, Black Native Americans throughout. And you can see our colors is the colors of the diaspora of what you can do. The other part that's interesting is that maybe some of us do have a little bit more than 12.5%. in our ancestry. Some Seminole natives of Florida did form communities with escaped African slaves, creating what is now known as the Black Seminoles. Hundreds of Africans traveled to Seminole Nation where they were forced to relocate to Native American territory. While some remained with those who stayed in Florida, others went with their other tribes that were kept constantly relocating. So, in 1835, a census showed that that at least more than 10% of Cherokee people had African blood before the Civil War. Africans living among the Cherokee people were either enslaved by them or were freed, but lacking citizenship. In 1866, the Cherokee Nation signed a treaty with the U.S. government recognizing those people as African heritage as full citizenship. So that's why a number of us who claim Cherokee citizenship or being part Cherokee comes from this, myself included. Now, if you dig more history, again, truth be told, the relatively recent history between the Cherokee Nation and African American people went through a rocky patch. Subsequently, that was kind of smoothed over, or legislation helped between negotiation between Africans and the Cherokee Nation in the last couple of years has kind of helped smooth that over. But again, when you discover your heritage, you have to acknowledge all the truth. And the truth is that there are a lot, like I said, 10, probably even more than 10% of African Americans can claim some Native American heritage. Now, one of the things that I do recommend is reading books on African American Native Black Indians. One, there are many, but one is called Black Indians by William Lawrence Katz. And this is a very good book. And I saw this book at first at I have just about all the museums in the Smithsonian here in Washington, D.C. We're fortunate and blessed that we have probably more museums in a concentrated area than anywhere else in the country. And here's a good part when I tell people to visit. They're free. Go to any other place in this country and your museums most likely are not free. So that's a resource and it's your resources. Everybody that's in this nation or anywhere, you come here, you could spend all day in one museum, so they're free. So one of my favorites is the Native American Museum. I remember when it opened. I remember touring it. The montage I had that you saw earlier of different people, different Native American pictures, that was inspired by when you go to the Native American Museum. There's an exhibit where you kind of sit in this rotunda. Well, first of all, there's a picture before you get in there, and it's a collage of all types of people, and they're all Native Americans, and they look like they basically cover the diaspora of the human experience. And so you get into this rotunda, and you see pictures, and you hear voices, and you hear them talking either in their native language or in English, and it's a collage, and it just basically goes to show how widespread and how influential the Native American people have ingrained themselves, or we ingrained themselves into their culture. Now, so it's not just Black Americans, but all kinds of Americans. So that goes to show. But one of the other things that I really enjoyed, I did discover this book on Black Americans, and I won't go into the details. I encourage you to read. But one of the things that you may find out that the book does highlight is different people in culture. For instance, the African American guides, particularly women, black slave women were really helpful for the colonials, where they made bridges, they formed bonds, they were able to communicate and translate when they ran into or they met other Native American tribes as they expanded across the West. This also includes, you find out about people, the African and Indian Alliance, known as the Pueblo Alliance, that had staged a revolt in 1680 that essentially ended Spain's rule of the Southwest for a dozen years. It introduces you to Francisco Menendez, who is a Native American, also Black and Hispanic freedom fighter. So in 1738, the Black Indian community that defended its liberty in Florida against British incursion. You also found out about the Lowry Gang, and some of these pictures here, the Lowry Gang, the one on the far right, that was a gang in North Carolina, or a group of Native Americans in North Carolina that fought against the Confederacy in the Civil War and continued to fight against the KKK after the Civil War. You'll find out about Lucy Parsons, the person I have in center, and I can go on. I could basically do a whole nother section on Lucy Parsons, but the most important thing you need to know that she was a fierce socialist and a labor representative fighting for workers. And basically, we wouldn't have an 8-hour workday if it wasn't for Lucy Parsons and her efforts and her passionate commitment to fair and treatment. So that's just a part of the inclusion of, as I said, the story of African American history is a story of all our history. And the Native American people is a part of that color, is a part of our history, and is a proud part that we are excited and proud to embrace. So that's a small part, and I thank you for this moment.
Amen.